Hello and welcome to another episode of the MBM podcast. My name is Amanda and I'll be your host for this and all episodes of the show. This episode of the podcast is brought to you in part by BeYogi. BeYogi is an online resource dedicated to providing yoga teachers and students with the inspiration and information and insurance they will need during every step of their yoga journey. BeYogi has drawn from their knowledge of the yoga world to not only create incredible content, but to also provide yoga and wellness professionals with the insurance coverage they will need to expand their careers. And I don't know about you, but I know that I run into a lot of places that won't let me teach or offer anything if I don't have insurance. So this is definitely something that if you don't have, you'll want to get. And they have an incredible things like online teaching coverage. So no matter what style you're teaching or wherever you are in the world, give yourself a little peace of mind knowing that you are covered should something happen. Head on over to beyogi.com/MBOM, so MBOM, to learn more or to get coverage today. This episode of the podcast is also brought to you in part by Fave Yogis. Do you teach privately? Make payment and registration a breeze. Use the Fave Yogis app to create and manage classes for your personal clients. Life is just easier with autopay. You can forget about remembering to Venmo, or if you're up in Canada, sending an invoice, an e-transfer, or a PayPal, depending on where your clients are in the world. With Fave Yogis, you can use autopay to enable repeating payments. This will save you so much time and make things so much easier. You can also keep your calendars in sync. Google Calendar integration automatically updates teacher and student classes when you make changes. It's still just your yoga. Teachers add classes, students add teachers and students stay connected. Head on over to the App Store and find Fave Yogis, FAVYOGIS. Use code MBOM and let them know that I sent you. All right, on to today's episode of the podcast. I am super excited to be joined by Rachel Schumont from the Yoga Counsel. Rachel came to yoga from a legal background. She made a complete 180 with her career, started teaching yoga, and has now combined her passion for the law with her practice of yoga. When she came to yoga, she recognized that a lot of yoga teachers were struggling with the legal side of business. And as much as I love the business of yoga, this is not something that I jam with. I really love branding and marketing strategies and figuring out how to create great classes and programs that people are going to come to. The legal side always feels so tedious to me. So in this episode, we talk about everything from liability insurance, waivers, contracts, contract negotiation, trademarking, what legal entities you can have your business as, and how to determine, which legal entity is best, as well as a ton of different other considerations to take into when you decide to become a yoga teacher and start a yoga business. Before we dive into the episode, just a couple of quick disclosures. First of all, Rachel practices law in the United States. So most of what we're talking about is specifically applicable to my Americans out there. So if you're hearing something like LLC and then you go to Google an LLC in your province, you might find that that's not a thing because we call them something different. So just know that a lot of these things are quite similar. It's going to be similar ideas. It's similar things to keep in mind, but we are very much talking about specific to America. And then my second disclosure is even with that, everything is going to be different state to state. So Rachel is from California. She practices law within the state of California, and she's very clear about disclosing when things are different and when you should find somebody within your state. But just know that there is going to be stuff that's going to be state dependent that you're going to have to look up for yourself or find somebody that you trust in your area. I 100% acknowledge that this is a massive pain in the butt. I wish this stuff was totally universal and we could just talk about it on a broader level. It would make having a yoga business so much easier. It would make understanding the legal side of having a yoga business so much easier. But unfortunately, that's just not the world we live in right now. So hopefully you can gather some stuff from here, regardless of which country you're from, tuning in, regardless of which state you're currently based in. And hopefully you'll come away with some good takeaways about how to make sure that your yoga business is really effective on the legal side of things. For me, this is the type of thing that I always want to just sort of ignore and focus on, the pretty upfront stuff like my social media or my branding or my logo, et cetera, et cetera. But this stuff is really, really important. It's the type of stuff that keeps us safe from a legal standpoint, both online as well as in the studio. All right, now with all of that in mind, here is the episode with Rachel Schumont. Rachel, welcome to the podcast today. I'm super excited to be chatting with you.
Me too. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I was super excited when we connected because I've never had somebody who kind of blends like yoga and law together. And I feel like it's something that I just don't have that much personal knowledge about. And so I'm super excited to dive into all things kind of legal business. Let's back up a little bit though. Can you tell me how you first got into yoga, what inspired you to teach, and kind of the story around that?
Yeah, definitely. So my father, actually, he took me to my first yoga class. I grew up in a suburb of Detroit called Plymouth, Michigan. And someone opened a now closed Bikram yoga studio that was right across from where I was working at the time. And I remember my dad, he came home from work one day and he was telling me about this new thing called Bikram yoga. And I think my sister actually went with him first, but eventually he got me to go. And at that point in my life, I really didn't know much about yoga. And I definitely don't think that I was prepared for the intensity of Bikram, but I fell in love immediately, and not necessarily with the style that I was practicing, but with how in tune yoga made me feel with my body. So when I moved to Florida to go to law school, there was this Power Vinyasa studio near my house, and I went and I checked it out. And from that point on, I just knew that yoga was going to be a constant in the rest of my life. So I continued practicing and learning, and as I finished school and started my legal career, I transitioned into working as an assistant public defender in Duval County, Florida. And towards the end of my time there, I was just completely burnt out. It's really hard, emotional work. And I really don't think, for being as young as I was, that I was able to completely disconnect from the realities of what was happening politically or with my clients. But on the other side of that, at that point in my life, my husband's career was thriving, and he heard me when I said that I needed a change. And so we moved to Southern California, and I took some time and really thought about the direction that I wanted to go in my career and my life and what I wanted to do. And I just knew that this was the time that I was going to get my teaching certification. So I found a studio and teachers that I resonated with, and I just went for it. And then while I was living in San Diego, I taught at that same studio, and I taught at different businesses around the area. My friend actually now owns a corporate yoga business that she was growing at the time. And I also volunteered at a local nonprofit there.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
Yeah.
And so did you continue to do like practice law while you were doing that? Or is that like you like completely let that side go?
I completely let it go. It was awesome. I just, I didn't even think about taking the California bar until much later. So I did freelance writing and I taught yoga, and it was just a wonderful point in my life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've never had a job that I think was that emotionally demanding, and also probably just demanding time wise and your mind and everything. But I can definitely relate to having a job that feels like very draining, and then you leave that and you take some space to figure out what you want to do. And there's something that's so magical about that time. Like, it's so freeing.
Oh yeah. Whenever I look back at that period of my life, I just, there's such good memories.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's cool too, because I actually decided to do my teacher training kind of after a period like that too. So it's interesting to hear how that's like similar to my story in a way as well. I love that.
Yeah.
And so you start teaching, and then, what kind of inspires you to like blend law with being a yoga teacher? Like, what was that kind of like, okay, like light bulb moment, I guess?
Yeah. So when I started teaching yoga, I was, like I said, I was just so happy, and I wasn't thinking much or at all about any liability that I was exposing myself to. And even though I had this legal background, I just wasn't thinking about it. And I had this moment in one of my yoga classes where one of my students did something completely unexpected. And fortunately, everything was fine, but it really made me stop and reevaluate my business and how I was exposing myself and my family's assets. And I was surprised that as I began to navigate through this process of making my own business more secure, that when I had a question about something or wanted to see what other yoga teachers were doing to protect themselves, there really wasn't any information or resources out there. And so I had to build this plan on my own, which is what I did. I just researched the laws in my area, what my options were for business entities, insurance, contracts, and I set up my business in a way that I felt was secure. And then my dream life in San Diego came to an end, and we moved to San Francisco for my husband's job, which is where I am now. We live just north of San Francisco. But there was still this huge part of me that really missed my legal career. And I was really inspired by the research and the planning that I was doing for my own business. And so I knew that this was something that other teachers, they had to be thinking about or struggling with. So since then, I've just been steadily building my business and offering what I've learned during my process to other yoga teachers.
Yeah, I think that's incredible because, you have that information, you've got that knowledge, you did all that research, that background. And I think it is for sure, like, even as somebody who I feel like I have got quite a bit of business knowledge, but I feel like that's definitely a gap for me. And it's something that people are like consistently asking about. Like, I had a bunch of people, for example, come through as a beta for my course, Yoga Business Bootcamp. And they're like, oh, something on like taxes and legal stuff would be great. And I'm like, well, it's just like a tough topic because I'm Canadian, like I was telling you. So I feel like it's like, I know how to do my taxes in Canada, but it's like, I know like a little bit about the US tax system because my boyfriend had a work visa for a year, but even that's a little bit different because he was just on a work visa. And it's like so complicated because then there's state taxes and et cetera, et cetera. And it's one of those things where I'm like, I just don't have the knowledge base to kind of dive into this. So I think you're serving a need in the yoga space for sure. Cause I think even more so than like not wanting to do Facebook ads, I feel like yoga teachers are like, I really, really don't want to have to deal with like insurance or liability or like setting up this business as an entity. Like, I just want to teach some yoga.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's like a huge misconception that it is super time consuming or complex. And there's certainly areas like taxes that you're talking about that are more complex than others, but it really doesn't. I mean, getting contracts in place, getting your business set up right, those things don't have to be super expensive and time consuming. So what I've tried to do is build a business that makes this accessible to yoga teachers.
Awesome. I love that. And so I think a good jumping off point for that is talking about like that first sort of step. So like you become a yoga teacher, you start teaching, you're getting more classes and you're like, okay, like, you kind of are a business, but I guess you're still like an individual is how you're acting. Like, how do you decide when to actually become a legal business? And then what type of business do you actually need to kind of register as?
Yeah. So before we get into all this, I just want to say that a lot of this information, it depends on where you live and the laws that govern in your state or your country. So the information that I'm going to be talking about is general. And if you have specific questions about your business, then you should consult with an attorney who is licensed in your area and who knows about the specialties of teaching yoga. But to answer your question, the type of business that you have can actually be super important depending on your needs and your personal situation because it can protect you from legal liability. And so people generally know about the different types of business entities, things like sole proprietorships, an LLC, corporations, partnerships. But most of us as yoga teachers, we're not going to incorporate or form a corporation for our yoga business because it is costly and time consuming to set up and maintain. So I'm not going to talk about incorporating here. I'm going to focus more on sole proprietorships and LLCs because that's generally the direction that yoga teachers go. So I hear often from yoga teachers that they aren't a business because teaching yoga is something that they do on the side or for fun. But if you are teaching yoga and you are making money teaching yoga, then you are a business. You are a legal entity. And by default, you are a sole proprietorship. So if you take no action in setting up a legal business, you are considered a sole proprietor. And the beauty of that is that there is no paperwork or fees to start or maintain this. But the downside is that a sole proprietorship, that legal entity does not provide liability protection for the yoga teacher. The teacher and the business are considered one and the same. So what that means is that the financial obligations, the debts of the business, those debts can be settled using the yoga teacher's personal assets, if that makes sense. And what that really looks like is that if you have a savings account or a house and you have debt that you've incurred for your business, or if a student is injured and sues you and obtains a financial settlement against you, to settle those debts or awards, your personal savings account and your house, your personal asset can be used to settle that. So that's with a sole proprietorship. An LLC, on the other hand, it essentially creates a wall between you and your business. And so those debts that I was just talking about, to settle those debts, they can only use your business assets, not your personal assets. So that is great. But the negative side of an LLC is that there are forms that you have to file and fees that you have to pay annually to maintain that LLC. So when you're deciding what you want your business to look like, I would suggest looking at your personal situation and considering if you have personal assets that you believe need to be protected. So if you are young and just starting out, you don't have much of a savings, you don't own a home, then maybe staying as a sole proprietor is good for you because there aren't fees, there aren't forms that you need to be filling out every year. But as you start to get older and create a savings, maybe you buy a home, maybe that's when you start thinking about forming an LLC so that you offer yourself and your personal assets some protection.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And is also looking at like how much money you're making through your business one of, I guess, like the important considerations? Like if you're only teaching yoga like a couple days a week, does it make sense to have an LLC, or is it like the most important factor is looking at like what you have in your personal assets?
Yeah, so I would say, you could be a millionaire. Let's say your partner makes a really large income, or you have a big savings and you're retired, let's say, and you start teaching yoga part-time and you're not making much money, but you have this large savings in the bank. Having an LLC would make sense so that you're protecting that money that's in the bank. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, definitely it does. Yeah, that's okay. That's like definitely a good consideration. I feel like I'd always thought about it from the side of like, oh, okay, like if you're just starting out, like maybe it doesn't make sense because there's additional fees and stuff like that. But I like kind of that differentiation of what it actually provides you with in terms of legal protection. And then with an LLC, does that become like, so all your money goes into your business, and then do you act as like an employee? Like, do you pay yourself? Is that how that works?
So it depends on how you set up your LLC, and your LLC the rules depend on the state. So if you're looking into that, it's best to consult with someone specifically in your state so they can talk to you about all the specific rules that go along with that.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's good to know. It's kind of funny. I met with a girl yesterday. We were just having lunch and we were talking about, she's a permanent resident in Canada, but she's Indian, and we were talking about like taxes, and I was like, oh, is it different? Blah, 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 as a permanent resident versus citizen. She's like, no, I don't think so. And then she was talking about how she does her taxes. I was like, wait, what? She's like, oh, I have like a corporation. And I was like, oh, okay. It was like this whole big like difference from how I do things as an individual, like as a sole proprietor. And I was like, oh, okay, this is like kind of an interesting
Yes.
Interesting conversation, just because it is so different depending on how you've set things up.
Yes, absolutely. In a corporation, your business is taxed, and then you pay yourself as an employee. So there's double taxation with corporations, depending on the type of corporation that you have. So that's why I'm saying there's so many specifics about it that it's hard to give general information on that. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's different in Canada as well. Like, we don't have LLCs. We've got something different.
I didn't know.
I think I could be wrong on that. So I'm actually going to look that up after this, just so I can confirm that I'm not totally off base. But I think it's a little bit different. Like, I think there's something that's slightly different within the LLC process, I think.
Oh, that's interesting. I definitely did not know that.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. I feel like Canada and the US are kind of like same, but different.
Yeah.
Just like slightly different. Okay, cool. So once you've decided kind of on how you want to set up your business, what's like the next step to actually taking action on this?
So, in terms of your business entity, the paperwork that you need, that, like I said, that depends on your local and state regulations. Generally, with a sole proprietorship, because it's that default entity, there isn't any requirement that you file anything formal. But you should be checking with your state and local government to see if you need a business license to operate in the area, and you should be paying any fees associated with that. Also, if you do form an LLC, like I said, there's paperwork that you have to file and maintain, and those documents are things like articles of organization. There's an operating agreement, but like I said, that they're governed by the state that you're in, so you need to check with the specifics of what actually needs to be filed for your state. Something else to consider is requesting an EIN, and this is U.S. specific. An EIN is an employee identification number, and you can get it for free through the IRS website. And it's good to use because if you're a sole proprietorship, you are going to be using your social security number, and you can use your EIN in place of that, so that if you're teaching at a bunch of different places, you aren't giving everyone your social security number. You can use your EIN instead.
Oh, that's interesting. I've seen that like on stuff before, but I never had any idea what that actually was.
Yeah, it's free. You can just go on the IRS website and get it. So it's definitely worth looking into.
Okay, and it'll link it's still under you as an entity.
Right.
It just means that you're not giving out like your social security number.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay, cool. That's awesome.
So something else to consider, and this is also state specific, is depending on your business name, some states require that you file for a DBA, or a doing business as, or an FBN, which is a fictitious business name. And it's just called different things. So, for example, if I was operating my business as Rachel Schumont Yoga, then here in California, where I am, we have to file for a fictitious business name. That's what it's called here. Mm-hmm. But because I would be using my given name as part of my business name, I wouldn't have to file for a fictitious business name. But because the name that I use for my company now is the Yoga Counsel, and I'm not using my given name as part of that, I do have to file for a fictitious business name. And essentially what that does is it alerts your community that you are the face behind your business, and it's you who's operating this business in your community. And that's by state, so you should look to see if that's required. And then one more thing to think about is depending on where you're teaching, if you're teaching in your home or in a park, for instance, sometimes your local government requires that you have specific permits or licenses for that. So that's something to look into too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely something. I live like just outside of a national park in Canada, and it's like the national park is like very, very strict on things like that. It's obviously like city dependent or town dependent in other places, but like the national park has like some pretty intense regulations around that. Like you can't just like take people on a hike and like do some yoga.
Yeah. I can imagine they would have a lot of requirements.
Yeah. I think it's just those little things that you want to think about, because I mean, it's like most likely it's like you're not going to get in big trouble. But I think that, if you're building a business around something, you want to be really cautious about like, hey, most of my income's coming from like running donation classes in the park this summer. And then you do a couple of them and all of a sudden you're like in the middle of Shavasana and somebody comes through and like shuts that down. Not cool.
And then like slaps you with a penalty on top of that you don't want to pay.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think it's just good to like do that due diligence so you know that everything's good beforehand.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's definitely a good thing to keep in mind. And so, I mean, this is probably state dependent again, but once people have kind of like decided what they're doing, like, can you get these forms online? Do you have to go into like a local business registry? Like, where do you kind of actually go to figure all this stuff out?
Yeah. So really what it takes is time and research or finding someone, who knows what they're doing in your area, who can do it all for you. Because all these things can be different. For instance, you go on the IRS website to get the EIN, LLCs, you go to your state's business website. If you're looking at permits and licenses, you're going to your local community. So for instance, when I filed my business license here, it was with my city. So it depends on where you are and what the rules are in your area.
Gotcha. And I don't know, this might be kind of like an outside the box question, but I guess I'm just thinking about like, if you move states, do you have to change your LLC or how does that work? Like if you change where you're basing yourself?
No, you would not have to change your LLC. I don't know. I would have to do more research on that. But I'm going to say I'd have to do more research on that before I answered it.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's totally fair. And that's definitely like kind of an out there question because I think there's like, I mean, this stuff becomes so tough because I feel like it's really not straightforward. Like it's like there's a lot of gray area. And I even had, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, but I had somebody in my private Facebook community be like, my friend and I are starting a business together and we want to register as an LLC, but we live in different states. Like, whose state do we register in? And I was like, I have no idea.
I'm 99% sure it's probably an online business if they're living in different states is what I'm guessing. But I'm 99% sure you could do either. Mm-hmm. And then if you file for an LLC in one state, I'm pretty sure that it is just your LLC period. But before I said that definitively, I'd want to do more research.
Yeah. So does it make a difference if you're like an online entity versus an in-person entity?
As far as an LLC?
Yeah, and just like starting your business, getting your forms, all that sort of stuff.
I don't believe so, but again, I'd want to look at the specific state and what the specific state is requiring.
Right. So looking into like what your like current, because everyone like kind of I guess has a permanent address and sort of like a home, but looking into like what that state sort of requires and the rules around that. Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I travel a lot and like I work remotely and I travel and there's like still because it's like a very new thing. I feel like the governments haven't like quite caught up with it. So it's like I feel like there's a lot of gray area around stuff like that. So my residency is like still in the province of Alberta. I pay like my provincial taxes there and my federal taxes in Canada, even though I spend like most of my year outside of Canada. And it's like kind of a weird thing where it's like I don't really think I'm breaking any laws, but it's also like I think there's a lot of area where it hasn't been disclosed because it wasn't something that people were doing even like 10 years ago.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I feel like there's just a lot of gray area in the law, period, as well. Yeah, for sure. Do you have any tips, and this is again kind of like an out there question, do you have any tips if people are trying to find stuff and maybe they are doing something that's a little bit more kind of like outside the box, kind of like I do, like from I guess kind of doing your best job with your due diligence to make sure that you're not doing something that's illegal? Like, is it just doing a bunch of research and doing your best to make sure that you're like hitting all the things that you need to do? You know, I think that, yes, it is research, but I think it's also finding someone who is in your area who knows the specifics. And oftentimes you can just do a consultation with them and they'll review your business and give you pointers. But I mean, if you feel like you can do that on your own and research, the resources are out there. You just got to find it.
Right. So it's just kind of like
Right.
going through a bunch of like legal information.
Yeah. I'm very type A. So if I have a question, I like to find someone who is in my area, who knows what I'm talking about. And I like to say, look, I'm doing X, Y, Z. Is this right? But that's me personally.
Yeah. Yeah. No, for sure. I definitely sit more in the type A camp as well. So I totally get that. I think though, like because my lifestyle is a bit unusual, I feel like I've gotten used to like, we're not really sure. And I'm like, okay, just rolling with it.
Yeah. Maybe you're the trendsetter, and people are going to follow what you do.
Yeah, I have no idea. People should probably not follow what I'm doing because I don't know if I'm doing anything right. I'm trying though. Okay, awesome. Is there anything else when it comes to like the forms, like knowing what forms to fill out, what's important? Is there anything else in there for people to consider?
I think that I've touched on all of the highlights about what forms there are. There are going to be random things that you need, and like I keep saying, it's just going to depend on where you are and what your local and state government is requiring.
Mm-hmm. Cool. We basically need you in like all 50 states then. Right. And all provinces of Canada. And potentially in the UK and Australia as well.
I'm hoping to get there eventually.
Yeah, for sure. Slow and steady. I feel like it's a lot of information to probably learn and digest and figure out. Yeah. It's not straightforward. Hey everyone, we're taking a quick break from the podcast to talk about how to get more students to your yoga studio. Hey yoga studio owners, I'm guessing you probably opened your studio because you love yoga and want to help others live longer, healthier lives. And you probably want to make a living at it, right? But if you're like many of the other studio owners I know, reality has started to creep in. You're discovering you have to wear all the hats to keep costs down. You're the owner, you're the teacher, you're the accountant, you're the marketer, and you're the salesperson. And instead of making a healthy profit, you're living paycheck to paycheck, working long hours just to keep the lights on. Your personal practice has fallen off because there's just not enough time in the day and you're exhausted. You've tried every kind of marketing under the sun, but nothing brings new clients through the door. And you didn't start this business to twiddle your thumbs. Well, I want to tell you there's a better way. I want to show you how to stop working so hard, bouncing from one thing to the next and trying a bunch of stuff that you've seen on the internet that just doesn't seem to be working. If I gave you our complete system that will help you get a minimum of 10 to 20 new students every single month, would that be worth a little bit of your time? Here it is. Ron Medlin and his team at GetYogaStudents.com has developed a 3-step system that will help you quickly grow your yoga studio to 6-figure profits and beyond without being shackled to your business. So if you're ready to grow fast and you'd like the blueprint to help you get started, visit GetYogaStudents.com today to get the exact system Ron and his team uses to help his yoga studio clients add 10, 20, or even 30 new students every single month. Head on over to GetYogaStudents.com and book your free consultation today. All right, back to the podcast episode. So coming kind of to like business names, I feel like this is something that you kind of hear is like, okay, you go to call your business something and it's like, oh, you should probably make sure that somebody else hasn't called that. And then there's all these kind of other things around like, do you like trademark it and that type of thing? Like, what are some of the things that we need to consider about naming our business?
So once you decide on a business name, it's important to consider if you want to protect that name as a brand. And if you create a brand that's based on your business name, it's likely that you don't want someone else using it. And in order to prevent someone else from using it, you would need to file a trademark application. In the United States, you can file it either with your state or with the federal Patent and Trademark Office. And you can trademark any name, word, symbol, and if you want to use that to identify and distinguish your services from others. It is important to note that if you file for a trademark with your state, then your trademark protection is limited to that state. So a yoga teacher in another state could still use your name. And I've also heard that there might be confusion about obtaining a business license with your business name and whether or not that also serves as a trademark. And the answer is no. Your business license is essentially the government in your area saying you are allowed to operate this business in our area under that business name. But your trademark affords you the protection of no one else being able to use that name. And so I guess the question is, should you trademark? And there are a lot of pros, especially if you have a unique name, and that people recognize that name and understand that you're providing this high level of service under that name. And if someone else started using that same name, it could confuse your clients. If the services offered by that other teacher weren't as good, you could lose clients and business. So there's a lot of pros with trademarking. But the downside is that filing for a federal trademark can be really expensive. The lowest filing fee, I believe, is $200 or $225. And it's also a complicated process. And the average fee for hiring an attorney to help you with that is about $1,500.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it can be really expensive. So when you're trying to decide if you do want to trademark your name, something to consider is the uniqueness of your name. So if you're operating, if I was operating again under Rachel Schumont Yoga, I don't know of any other Rachel Schumont in the United States. So it's not likely that there's going to be another yoga teacher around here who is also teaching yoga under my name. So I wouldn't be rushing out to trademark Rachel Schumont Yoga. But if you're using a unique name and you're growing this business and this brand, trademarking would be something that you might want to consider more.
Right. Just so that they don't take it. And then does it become an issue if, so say like, I don't know, let's just use like MBOM as an example. So if I decide not to trademark MBOM because it feels like, oh, nobody else is going to call like their yoga business MBOM because it's super random name.
Yeah.
But then somebody does and they trademark it, does that mean that I can't use it anymore?
It's complicated and I don't know the Canadian laws, but essentially yes, but there could be arguable issues about it. So it's not a straightforward answer that I could give you.
Okay, got it. Yeah. And then you were saying like if you trademark within a state, you only own it within a state. Is it possible to like do a worldwide trademark?
Oh, I don't think so. Not that I know of, but anything is possible. I do know that you can either file in a state or you can get federal protection so that it's across the United States. But I've never heard that you can do worldwide, but I don't know. I'm going to look into that now.
But you can get like across like the U.S. So you could either trademark like in the state of California or across the entire United States.
Yes, definitely.
And then I guess if you're naming a business, and I think this is where like I like never think of these things. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm just going to call this thing. It's like, I guess something that we need to be considerate of because you can't name something somebody else's trademark if they're trademarked like across the country.
Right. So if you started MBOM and there was already an MBOM and that person was not happy about it, then they could sue you.
Right. Okay. So the trademark just covers like that area. So say there was like an MBOM trademarked in the US, I could still operate in Canada. I
have no idea, actually.
It's so interesting. Like there's so much gray area within this stuff. Hey, it's just like so many things to try and think about.
Yeah, I know, especially with how online our businesses are becoming. So I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, I can look that up as well.
Yeah, I'm going to research it. I'm so interested now.
Yeah, I'm
I wonder if someone has tried to do that before.
I mean, people have tried to do all sorts of things. I'm sure it's like somebody might have tried to do it. I do know there was. So my boyfriend's parents own a winery in Canada, and they were calling their brand of port something that I think another winery in the US had trademarked. And I think they actually like had to change it.
Oh, interesting.
So maybe there is something with that. Like maybe and maybe it's like levels of it. Like maybe there's state and federal and maybe there's like another sort of protection. I really have no idea, but it's one of those things that a friend was talking to me about. Like she was like, oh yeah, I'm deciding if I want to trademark or not because there's like 2 other businesses in California with really similar names. And like, I don't want somebody to take this name. And it was just something that had literally never crossed my mind. Like I had never thought about like, oh, maybe I should trademark MBOM.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've established such a presence that it isn't likely. I mean, if you Google MBOM, it's pretty clear what you've established with that. So the odds are that someone else would try and use your name are probably not that likely, but it could happen. And if it's something that you're concerned about, having a trademark, it could protect you.
Yeah, it's just interesting to think about these things that we just often don't think about. Like, it's just not naturally where my brain goes. So then I'm like, oh, right, these things that I need to think about when it comes to my business.
Yeah, all these things, lots of things.
Is there a place that, like, there must be a website where we can go look at, like, what's been trademarked?
Yeah, so in the U.S., it's the Federal Patent and Trademark Office. I think it's like ftpo.org.
Okay. Okay, cool. That's good to know. I feel like that's like a good place to start when you're going to name something before you kind of go into that like whole process, especially like knowing that it's forms and fees and can be like a little bit of a daunting thing for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Is there kind of on that same thread, is there things that we need to consider when it comes to websites?
Yes, definitely. So most of us as yoga teachers, we have a website, and our clients can go there to sign up for classes or schedule private sessions or sometimes be purchasing products through that site. So there are federal, state, and local laws that regulate how we sell things on our websites. And it's important for yoga teachers who use websites to sell, that they include a section on their website that is a privacy policy. And what that does is that it tells your website visitors how and why their personal information is being collected and shared. So even if you just have a section to sign up for a newsletter and you're collecting emails, it's important to let your website visitors know what you're doing with their email addresses, how they're collected, and how they're being stored. So having a privacy policy is important, and also a terms and conditions section on your website. That is essentially it's a legally binding agreement or contract. And so like I've been saying about other things, because it is a binding contract, it's important to have someone in your area review it or draft it for you. But there's a lot of reasons why to include terms and conditions on your website, but it essentially defines the conduct that is allowed for your website, and it grants your visitors a limited license to use your site as long as they are complying with your terms. It also makes clear that the content that you have on your site is your intellectual property, and that your visitors, they can't take it or use it as their own. It can also establish the law that will govern if there is an issue that arises out of using your website. So people from all over the world can access your website, and if there is an issue or any litigation that comes out of your website, it's important that it would be important to me to litigate it in the area where I live and I work. So you can establish that as part of your terms and conditions. And those are just a few of the things that terms and conditions can cover. But like I said, because it is a legally binding contract, it's important that it be drafted correctly.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. I remember kind of when the whole GDPR stuff was going around, there was like a lot of sort of conversation around this that felt like a little bit confusing. But it was at that point that I like added a privacy policy to my website. I was like, I've never had this before. Yeah. And I was like, I don't get it. Why do I have to have this?
There's so many rules and specifics to it that, that it's important to talk to someone who knows what they're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially like in your area, so you can make sure that it's like specific to what is required for you, either like federally or statewide or provincially.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Yeah. And I guess there's probably a lot of other things within that, especially like if you're in the EU around the GDPR stuff, which we definitely do not have to get into. That makes my brain like turn to a pile of mush.
I can see how.
Yeah, for sure. I was like, can I just put like a disclaimer on my website that says like, if you're European, just don't sign up? Like, not to discriminate, love Europeans, happy to work with them. I'm just like, this like actually makes me super confused.
Yeah, there's a lot involved in that.
Yeah, for sure. When I was reading it through, and even people who were breaking it down simplifying it, I was like, this is not simple. This is not straightforward. Right. I'm still super confused. I was really feeling for like the European businesses. I have a friend, and she's actually been on my podcast a couple times. And she sent out an email that was like, you have to like re-opt in. And I was like, man, she's worked so hard for her, like to build her email list, and then to have people take action on that again. It's like, that's really frustrating.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyways, total side note. Is there anything else with that to consider before we dive into kind of more of that like hands-on in studio type stuff?
I think that there's definitely a lot to consider for your business name and your website in general, but there's so much, and there's so many specifics that that you need to talk to someone who's in your area, who knows what they're doing.
Okay, awesome. Sounds good. All right. So jumping into kind of, I guess, like actually being a yoga teacher within the studio space, one of the first things we do as yoga teachers when we get hired is we sign a contract. And I've definitely signed these before, and I feel like they've always been like pretty standard. But is there anything like specific that we should be looking for when we're signing that contract, or even like that we should be negotiating?
Yes, definitely. So here in the U.S., most states respect the theory that people are free to agree to or contract for whatever terms they want, as long as it's legal. And teaching yoga is not an exception. So we have the right to negotiate our hiring terms, and we should definitely be doing that. And because your contract can be lengthy and confusing, it's important to have someone who knows what they're doing either draft it or review it for you. But before you sign something, you should first determine how your studio is classifying you, whether you are an employee or an independent contractor. And that depends on state law and different factors. So even if your studio says that they're hiring you as an independent contractor and you sign an independent contractor agreement, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are an independent contractor, and your state may find that you are an employee. They'll look at things like how much control the studio has on how you teach. Maybe they tell you the style that you have to teach, or if you have to play certain music, or if you have to wear certain things, or if you're doing work that is outside of just teaching yoga. So if you're helping clean up the restroom, or you're doing supply runs, those things affect how you are treated or classified under U.S. law. And once you understand that, understanding that is important, because employees, they get certain benefits that maybe independent contractors, they generally don't. It affects how you're paid, and it affects how you pay taxes. So first establish how you're being classified, and talking to someone who knows the employment laws in your area would be helpful, because then you're signing the correct agreement, either an employment contract or an independent contractor agreement. And then you negotiate your terms, and there's so many things that can be included in either. So I'll just highlight a few things to look for. Nailing down your payment terms is really important. So things like how you're getting paid, whether you get a percentage for people that you bring into the studio, when are you being paid? Do you get paid extra for workshops or teacher trainings? How much are you getting paid? And because I think that teaching yoga, it can become an intimate setting, and teachers and studio owners who hire them can become close or friends. So having your payment terms nailed down right off the bat can help avoid any uncomfortable situations in the future. Some other things that you can and should negotiate are your benefits. So you can negotiate vacation time, sick time, health insurance, retirement benefits, depending on where you're working. Does the studio require you to carry liability insurance? Because some studios do. It doesn't need to be a specific amount, and who pays for it. Oftentimes, studios will include a section in their agreements for a finder's fee. And essentially what that means is that so teachers who are teaching for a long time in studios, sometimes they form bonds with their students, and those students will then hire them for private sessions. In some studios, they say that they get a percentage of what that student is paying you, and they call it a finder's fee. So you can negotiate if that studio does get the finder's fee and how much they get. And then one other thing to consider is how you end the contract. So for either the studio owner or for you as the teacher, you want to know if you want to end the contract, do you have to give written notice, and is there a specific time frame that you have to give them before the contract ends?
Yeah.
So those are just a lot of stuff. I
know. No, it's good though. It's really good to know all of that, because I think that, even like, I feel like one of the best examples is like, if you like go to rent a car and there's like, you kind of have to agree that you've read everything. I feel like for me, I'm always like, okay, is there anything like weird in here? Like, is there anything I actually like you need to tell me about? And I feel like they're always like, no, it's just standard. But it's like, what even like does all of that mean, Yes. And I think that when we don't really understand it, it's like we just want to not read the nitty gritty. We just want to sign it. Obviously, employment contracts are a little bit different because I think we have more buy-in, especially in terms of like what we're getting paid and like if they can fire us with no like, I don't know, no notice and that sort of stuff. But I think it's definitely still the thing where it's like there's a lot of gibberish, I feel like is the word that's coming to mind. Like things that were just like, is this relevant? I don't know. What does it actually mean? Seems standard. I'm just going to sign it. Like I want this job.
Yeah, definitely. And, there's a lot of attorneys out there who, for a small consultation fee, will review it for you. And so, I mean, it's up to you as a teacher, but maybe paying that small fee to have someone look at it, would give you that peace of mind. Or they could say, hey, look, this is what you're agreeing to if you don't know.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. I think too, it's good to review that stuff. Just make sure it sits well with you. Make sure that you're happy with it. And then, before you sign it, like remembering that you're also offering a service to that yoga studio and that you're valuable and that you should be making, an amount of money that you're happy about, that you're okay with like the end of contract rules on either side and all that stuff. Like I think sometimes we feel like, oh, okay, we just got to sign this as opposed to like countering it. But I think it's really important to make sure you understand those things.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Okay. And then liability waivers and insurance. I feel like these are ones that come up quite a bit, and I work as a studio manager, so I feel like it's also something that I deal with on that side. Like a lot of things that I didn't realize, like we have to make sure that, if somebody hasn't signed up on Mind Body Online, that we make sure they sign a waiver when they come to class, which is making sure that the teachers do that then. And then we have to, I think the studio owner has to hold them for like 7 years or something like that. I don't know if that's like a Canadian thing, but yeah, he's got like boxes of like paperwork in his basement.
Oh my goodness.
Because like, I think too in Canada, I don't know what it is in the US. I think, you have to hang on to your taxes for like 6 or 7 years, like all your business tax stuff.
There's definitely time frames here. I believe it is state dependent, but I'm not sure about that.
Mm-hmm.
But I actually have, this is what comes up most often when I'm talking to yoga teachers. It's liability waivers and insurance. And it's really interesting to me that you combined these into like one question, because they actually can be really intertwined to the point where if a yoga student sued the teacher, likely they'd be arguing about the validity of the liability waiver, but the yoga student could then bring in the insurance company into the lawsuit. So they can just get really intertwined together. And also it's become common for waivers to include some sort of arbitration clause that says that if there is a dispute, you're going to resolve the dispute in private arbitration as opposed to in a courtroom. And some insurance companies say that the yoga teacher, they can't waive an insurance company's right to have issues litigated in a courtroom. So it's smart to talk to your insurance company about things like that to make sure that your liability waiver isn't voiding your insurance protection.
Okay.
So, but to answer your question about best practices for liability waivers and insurance, the best practice is to have a well-drafted liability waiver and insurance in place before you start teaching. They are two really important steps to take when you're setting up your business, because both of them can lower your liability as a yoga teacher. And so if you're already teaching and you don't have one or a liability waiver, or you don't have insurance, that's something you should start looking into. But generally, in terms of law and insurance, I don't have a ton to say about that specifically. In general, we all know that having insurance is important. We have it for our homes and our cars and our lives. So we should have it for our businesses that we're working so hard to build. And then if something goes wrong, it's likely that your insurance is going to cover you and you aren't losing business or personal assets. But for liability waivers, I have a ton to say. I hear a lot about liability waivers from teachers, and some teachers seem to believe that they offer no protection at all. And some teachers seem to believe that they ensure that there will never be a lawsuit filed against them. And both are not necessarily true. The validity and enforceability of a liability waiver, it depends on state law. And there are some states, like in Virginia, that they just won't enforce them at all. But that doesn't necessarily mean that if you live in an area that doesn't enforce them, that you shouldn't have it, or that it does no good, because some people consider that liability waivers act as a deterrent, so that if a student signs a liability waiver, they believe that they have waived their right to any recourse in a courtroom. And even if they live in an area that doesn't enforce liability waivers. But essentially what that does is it can encourage the student, the teacher, the studio owner to resolve the issue without a lawsuit being filed. So a liability waiver is always a good idea. It just puts people on notice that, hey, there's these risks that can be involved in doing this. And, I want you to know that before you get in here and start doing it. Also, because waivers are different depending on the state that you're teaching in, it's important that your waiver comply with that state law. And so it's important to have someone who knows your state law either draft it or review it. And then one last thing about waivers. So the effectiveness of your waiver, it depends on whether your student understood the risks that are inherent in the style of yoga that you're teaching, and whether they are knowingly waiving their rights to litigate an issue because of those inherent risks. So what that means is that if you are using a template that you got online, or you're using a waiver that your friend is using and you just modify it for your own, it's not always the best idea, because it may not specifically address the risks inherent in the type of yoga that you are teaching in the area that you're teaching.
Right. I feel like that's a really good consideration, because I feel like it's like, liability waiver, you Google it, you find a PDF, you download it, you make some changes to it, and then you continue on your way. And I think, that's obviously the easiest way to do it. But I think, and not necessarily that doesn't work, but I think it's just taking that extra step to be like, what is this actually saying? And is this actually relevant for what I'm doing and where I'm doing it?
Yeah.
For people who are teaching online kind of around the world, because I feel like, there's lots of people who are building businesses online. Is there a sort of standard waiver you can use? Or is it very much you need to consider where your business is and make sure it's with where your insurance and your business is located, and then you can just teach online from there?
I would say that is very specific to your business. You can have a liability waiver, but if it's not complying with where you're teaching, then the chances that it would be enforceable and valid just are lowered.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that's definitely something good to consider for sure. I feel like these are definitely the ones that I hear about the most as well, with regards to people having questions. And I think it's also interesting because if you teach with a studio, most often I think studios kind of do that waiver aspect. Because Mind Body Online does if you register online, they'll do that aspect for it. And then I think like one of the things we make sure the teachers do at the studio that I work for is like, sometimes they don't understand the importance of like, oh, this is a new student. Like you need to have them sign our waiver.
Yes.
Like it's not just about collecting their information. Like we actually need them to sign this legal document before they practice yoga. And I think sometimes they're just like, oh yeah, like I forgot to get their email address. And it's like, it's much more than that.
Yeah. And there's actually a lot of interesting things that come up with that too, because I haven't seen any specific litigation on this, but the fact that people, I do it too when I go to a new studio and I sign up through MindBody and I sign the waiver electronically. I was thinking, my husband could go online and set up my account for me and he could sign it. And then I could say that I never signed the waiver. So electronic liability waivers are interesting to me. And I don't know what, how that's going to look down the road because I don't think there's been any litigation on it.
Yeah, right. I feel like it's one of those things, like a lot of this has kind of shifted, I think, over the last couple of years as, software as technology has become better and it's grown at such a rapid pace too. It's like, nobody was working online and then all of a sudden it was like, oh, you can pretty much work online in any job. Right. Almost. Like even doctors can like practice online now. Yep. It's like a wild, crazy, cool world that we live in. But then on the legal side of it, it's like, how does that catch up and how does that, what does that side of things look like? So that's definitely an interesting thing to think about as well.
Yeah.
As a yoga teacher, I guess to make sure, like, I think one of the big things is like you sign your contract and then you should be asking these questions, right? About waivers and insurance once you're getting employed with somebody.
Yes, because it isn't necessary that the studio's waiver cover the teachers. So if I was being hired in a studio, I would want to look at the studio's waiver and make sure that it is specifically addressing the yoga teachers, because it could be a waiver that's in place to solely protect the studio. So that's something important to look at.
Right. Okay. And then I think because sometimes studios will provide insurance as well. So I guess just making sure that like, okay, does this insurance like protect me if something happens in my class is important. And then going from there to make sure that you're protected. I feel like it's one of those things that like when you're starting out, it feels so complicated because not only is there a lot of information, but it feels like there's a lot of cash flow going out before the cash flow comes in. But I think it is important to consider like what the risks of not having that stuff are. Like I travel a lot and I always travel with travel insurance. And I know a lot of people who don't travel with travel insurance just because it can be expensive. But for me, it's like my boyfriend got his appendix removed while we lived in the US. And like if we hadn't had travel insurance, like he either would have had to fly back to Canada or like paid $40,000.
Yeah.
So it's like that's a really expensive procedure and that's a minor surgery. Like that's like the surgeon was so chill about it. It was like stressing me out because I was like, you're taking an organ out of his body. And he's like, this is really routine. Like I do this a bunch of times a day. I was like, okay, no big.
Yeah. And I think that people, yoga teachers think that, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to spend $5,000, $6,000 to get my business set up so that it's secure. And that isn't necessarily the case. If you find someone in your area or you already have something drafted just to review something, it might not cost as much as you think.
Right, for sure. So it's kind of like debunking the fact that it doesn't need to be as expensive as they might think it is, but that also the money you're going to invest in it is going to be worth it to protect you. Because once you've got that stuff set up, then you can teach without worrying about like if somebody's got something going on in their body or if something happens and that sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Yeah, that's really good to know. Is there any other kind of like little tips with liability waivers that we should be keeping in mind? Are those kind of the major ones?
Those are kind of the major ones. There's always specific things that come up. And that's why I think it's really important to talk to someone. Liability waivers are they're just state dependent. So different states have different rules. Even things about like, even personal preference, like if you wanted to include an arbitration clause and what the pros and cons of doing private arbitration versus being in a courtroom are, and talking to someone in your area about the pros and cons of that, could be, really helpful to you down the road. There's just like tons of little issues that could be included in that in any contract.
Right. So it's almost kind of like with doing taxes, like sometimes it's just better to hire somebody who knows exactly what they're doing, get them to help you with all that sort of stuff. And then you don't have to stress about it.
Right. And then it's done right.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that's the biggest part. I'm like one of those really independent people who's like, I'm going to do it myself. And then I'm like, I don't know if I did this right at all.
Fingers crossed.
I did it, but I don't know if it's right. So yeah, I think there's definitely a time and a place to invest that money. And I think that this sounds like one of them to me, at least, since it's stuff that's like all a little bit, feels a bit soggy in my brain, I guess you could say. Amazing. Thank you for all that information. Do you have any other kind of tips around this for yoga teachers before we wrap up?
So one other thing that I was thinking about is that because there's no specific laws that regulate how we teach yoga. So with doctors or massage therapists or estheticians, there are laws that say you need this license or this degree. And I think there's this misconception that as yoga teachers, we aren't held to a legal standard, and that's not true. As yoga teachers, we're held to what's referred to as a reasonable person standard. So if one of our students said that we were negligent in some way, what a court would do if this was litigated is look at how a reasonable yoga teacher would have acted in the same setting that you were in. And so if a court found that you should have taken some action or should not have done something that you did, and you essentially fell below that standard, you can be found liable for negligence and then be responsible for damages to your student, so medical expenses. So I think it's important that as yoga teachers, we understand what this standard looks like in the real world when we're teaching, because once we understand that, then we can develop a protocol for our own business, for planning and teaching our classes so that we're offering a safe space to our students, but we're also protecting ourselves and our businesses.
Yeah, that's a great tip. That's a good one. I feel like you're just dropping so many golden nuggets. So thank you for that.
It's so dense.
Yeah. But I mean, I feel like you've really made this very understandable. Like you've broken it down in a way that I feel like I already okay, I feel like I understand this a little bit better, and coming from a point of like, oh, this feels like really heavy stuff that I'm not quite familiar with. So yeah, thank you for that.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
If people want to learn more about you, maybe hire you for your services or just check out your resources, which I know you've got lots of, where can they go to find you?
Yeah, so my website is theyogacounsel.com, and teachers can go there to download a free 15-point checklist that I developed as sort of a starting point to self-audit your yoga business, and it's free. So you just go on the homepage of my website and you can download it there. And you can also on my website schedule a free 30-minute consultation. So if you have concerns about your business or you are confused about what direction you need to go in, you can schedule a free consultation with me and we can talk about it. Also, in the next couple months, I'm going to be releasing a couple of online courses. On May 1st, I'm going to be releasing a course on the ins and outs of liability waivers, and that's where teachers can go to learn more about why liability waivers are important and what they actually say or can say. So I actually go in and I break down all the different components that can be included in a liability waiver and what they say and what they mean and how they protect you. And there's also a bonus section in there that focuses on minors and liability waivers, which is just a really interesting area of law. And then on July 1st, I will be releasing a course on how yoga teachers can lower their exposure to liability. And that's going to outline the best practices for preparing and leading yoga classes so that, like I said, you're protecting yourself and your business as well as your students. And then I am also on Instagram at the Yoga Counsel, and I have a free Facebook group, Yoga for the Teacher, and I offer free legal tips there for yoga teachers.
Oh my gosh, amazing. So much good stuff. Rachel, thank you so much for this.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Whew. Okay, guys, you made it. There are plenty of notes about everything that Rachel talked about in that episode on the show notes at mbomyoga.com. A couple of quick things that I just wanted to confirm that we actually did some Google searching on after the episode. So I looked up, if you decide to move, do you have to transfer your LLC to another state? I found a great article and I've linked that on the show notes for you guys. So if you are somebody who's moving states and you are curious about the actual official answer to that, I do have some information for you. As well, Rachel actually looked up the trademarking with regards to countries, and she found out that you actually have to trademark and file in each country. So if for some reason you're looking to have a trademark protection, outside of the country you live in, then you can file it in other countries as well. Otherwise, you can just file it in your own. Of course, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, make sure you reach out to myself or Rachel. You can connect with me at info@mbomyoga.com. I always love hearing from you guys. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Mastering the Business of Yoga, and you can join the private Facebook community at Yoga Business Badasses. Just a quick reminder that Meghan Pherrill and I still have a few spots left in our yoga teacher and wellness professionals retreat that is coming up in Costa Rica in November. It's November 2nd to 9th, 2019 in Nusara, Costa Rica at the Bodhi Yoga Resort, and it is going to be super fun. It's an all-inclusive week. Your meals, accommodations, yoga, workshops, waterfall hike, transportation, everything is included. And we've created a nice balance between morning and evening practices, lots of free time in the afternoon to beach it, to hang by the pool, to do your own practice, as well as getting some value out of it. So workshops to help you grow and expand your yoga business every day. Of course, if you have any questions about that, you can email me info@mbomyoga.com. Otherwise, you can find all of the details at bit.ly.com/yoga teacher retreat CR or mbomyoga.com/retreats. All right, that's all for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week. Namaste.